right. Good evening, everyone. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. I'm really excited to be here with all of you tonight during Trans Week of Visibility. Trans Day of Visibility is this Sunday, happens to be Easter. We can make many metaphors of that if we want, but I'm excited because I'm talking to Griffin Hansbury. He is the author of Vanishing New York and Feral City. He wrote those under the name Jeremiah Moss. He is a Pushcart Prize winner and Lambda Literary Award finalist. His writing has appeared in several publications, including N+1, the New York Times, and the New Yorker, as well as the Paris Review Online. He is a trailblazer in the field of psychoanalysis. He was the first analyst to practice and publish as openly transgender. He lives in Manhattan. And the book we are here to celebrate tonight, Some Strange Music Draws Me In, is under his name Griffin Hansbury. It's one of my favorite books of this year, probably my favorite book of this year, and one of my favorite trans novels of all times. It's on the list of one of my favorite novels of all time. I just immediately fell in love with it. And I've been a proselytizer for it, so I'm very excited that Griffin graciously agreed to join us during this week to talk about his work. So welcome, Griffin. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. I appreciate all your support, and it's good to be here, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yes, I have to joke that my coworkers were like, they always like to joke about how all white trans men look alike, and when they went to make the flyer, they were like, "See."
Yes,
So from one cousin to another,
yes,
I'm
yes, yes, it's true.
glad that we can be here in our kinship, and glad for all of our people watching at home. Thank you for being with us tonight. We'd love for you to put comments in the chat, questions, shout out where you're watching from. We really do like to take questions from the audience, so please feel free to do that. So I want to jump right in. So, before I even knew anything about your book, I was drawn to the title. It's one of my favorite Patti Smith songs. Probably a lot of that's probably not that novel, but tell me a little bit about your relationship to music as sort of a gateway for the characters in this book.
Sure. Well, in the first scene, the music comes in right away, where Max, as a young person, is Mel, and they're sitting in the local drugstore of the town, and this trans woman, Sylvia, kind of blows in. She drives a Trans Am, and she's got this music blasting from the car. And, I think particularly in the time before the internet, we were hungry for any kind of culture. And if you lived where I lived, which was, in the middle of nowhere, there wasn't a lot of culture that got in. And so this idea of this sort of like, this music blowing in on this car, and being Patti Smith as well, this kind of like, androgynous sort of figure, especially on the cover of that album Horses, right? That we were like any kind of queerness, transness, anything that was even seemed like a hint of it, even if it wasn't actually queer. You just sort of be so hungry for it. So that's that way it kind of comes in. That Some Strange Music is referring to the music, and it's the line from the Patti Smith song, which she graciously gave me permission to use for the title. But also, the strange music, I think, is also one's own imagining of oneself coming from the unconscious as a strange music that sort of overtakes you and leads you to another place. And it has that kind of viral quality, right? Music, especially when you're young, is like a virus that seizes you and goes from person to person, and can change your constitution in some ways, or awaken parts that need to be awakened.
Yeah, well, and in this case, it's sort of a siren song from a possibility model. We talk a lot about possibility models here in Georgia. We just ended our legislative session. We had all these anti-trans bills that were up, and they did not pass. As of midnight last night, they were all defeated, somewhat unexpectedly. But one of the things that we have argued again and again and again in trying to get these things defeated is that trans people need to see other trans people to know what is possible. And so in this book, Tell us a little bit about who Mel is at the beginning of this book, maybe frame it out a little bit, and who Sylvia is um, as she blows into town.
Yeah, sure, sure. So the narrator of the book is Max, who is a middle-aged trans guy in 2019, and he's telling the story looking back on his own youth in 1984 when he was Mel. And Mel is, Max uses the pronoun she, her for Mel, and I sort of use both she and they for Mel. Sometimes he. Mel's maybe a little bit more. There's a little more fluidity in them for me than for Max. But so Mel is a 13-year-old and living in a small town in Massachusetts in 1984 when they meet Sylvia. And Sylvia is a young trans woman, probably like early 20s. And she's lived in the city. She's been to New York. She lived in the Chelsea Hotel. She was photographed by Robert Mapplethorpe. So she's had the excitement of New York City, but she's come back to town after her mother has died. And in the present in 2019, Max has also gone back to town after his mother has died. So there's a little parallel there. But most of the action takes place in 1984, and it's about this, this intergenerational friendship between Sylvia, who's a young adult, and Mel, who is, 13, still a kid, and just figuring out who they are, and through the sort of alchemy of seeing this trans person, comes to realize that they too are trans. And like you said, we need to see trans people. Oftentimes we need to see trans people to know we're trans. We can know it without seeing it, but that's a lot harder.
Or we know we're something, but we don't necessarily like have the
Yeah,
words or the path. I
yeah,
think
yeah,
that's the thing
absolutely.
that often we struggle with. It's like, well, and it's clear with Mel. Like Mel knows something is they're not quite like the other girls, right? And I
Yeah,
do want to talk
yeah,
about their girlhood because I think
sure.
it's really nicely rendered in their friendship with their best friend, which is sort of a complicated and ambiguous friendship, and sometimes a romantic friendship, and sometimes not. Which I think many girlhood friendships are like that. Even if nobody ends up queer, like that romantic friendship
Hmm.
that a lot of teenagers experience, right?
Yeah.
Is super interesting. Um, I was thinking a lot about the that both of them come to town because their mothers are are dead, and in some ways it's a reversal of the sort of transphobic idea that a lot of cis parents have, that when their children come out as trans, like they have to grieve the child that now is lost to them or dead.
Mm-hmm.
And so to begin with both of these characters grieving their mothers
Mm,
feels like almost like it felt empowering to me in a weird way, to be
mm,
like, we have our own grief too. Like
right.
there's like so often I feel like stories center the cis experience of losing their trans children, or the idea of who their kid was going to be. And so
Right.
I really loved, like, let's center these two trans people's complicated grief, right?
Mm-hmm.
um, and even if your mother was not perfect, she was still your mom, and like both of
Right.
them articulate that really beautifully.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um,
I love that. I love hearing your interpretation of that. It was not something that was on my mind, so it's great to hear.
um, so yeah, let's talk about, in the summer of '84, Mel's hanging out, listening to music. What is the town like? What are Mel's? Because in some ways, I think what people can forget is this town feels like it's only like just a very close suburb of Boston, right? Like it doesn't feel like it's super far, but that might as well be on the moon for a
Right.
kid like Mel.
Right.
So, what are the sort of cultural conditions for a kid like Mel? What are their possibilities before Sylvia enters the scene?
Yeah. Well, it's a small working class town, and it is maybe like 25 miles outside of Boston or so. A drive, but like you said, might as well be on the moon because there's no public transportation, and there's not even a relationship to the city in this town, right? So the people who live in this town aren't going to go into the city. They're not interested in that. And so the town is very isolated from urban life. It's you know, I think I say in one point that the drugstore where they're reading Teen Beat magazine is like the only place to buy reading material in this town. There are no books in this town, right? And there's the library, thankfully, but other than that, there's really not a lot of ways to get um, counterculture. And so it's like, being living on an island somewhere. And again, without the internet, how do you access that, right? So it's a rough town. It's a town where, people, um, this is such a Gen X cliche, right? But the sort of like ways in which we sort of roamed free, unsupervised, and got into scrapes. And there's a lot of violence too. There's the kind of like everyday violence that you don't even think of as violence when you're living through it, and it's only afterwards when you get a different concept of violence that you realize, oh, that was actually not so great, right? Um, so there's a lot of not so great stuff that happens in this town. Um,
Well, I thought, particularly the girlhood stuff. I think so much of it made me think about how much our world has changed so quickly. Like that our conceptions of what violence is, and particularly gendered violence,
mhm,
has changed tremendously. Or racialized violence, like
sure.
just the way that we talk, the way that even people from these towns now like talk differently. I mean, they still like throw
Mhm.
around some stuff, but like there's a level of knowledge about like psychology, pop psychology that people have gotten from the internet. There's
Mhm.
all this therapy speak that's like layered over our whole culture now. There's so much, even if people don't really know what it means or know how to act on it.
Yep.
We're living in this era where people just have so many more resources at their fingertips, and so
Right.
it feels again like folks are living on the moon, and it's only
Yeah.
40 years ago, but
Yeah.
it feels it really might as well be ancient history. It's much closer to ancient history, um, because of how much information changes possibility.
Absolutely. It makes me think of the relationship between Max and Dakota, his great niece, and how she is really like she's living in even further boondocks, but in 2019, she has access to information and language like the word cisgender, right? Which was not a word that existed until I was probably in my 40s. And um, you know, when you don't have the words, you can't think the thoughts. And once you have the language, the thoughts can just sort of blossom from there. And you can think you can think parts of yourself that weren't thinkable before, right? And so when young people have the language, and not just young people, but people who wouldn't have the language before have that language, so much more becomes possible. So much
Yeah,
more evolution and growth and ideas about oneself become possible that just couldn't happen.
yeah. And what I appreciate about your novel, as opposed to some didactic tract that we trying to get people to read, it's like this intuitively illustrates that. Like,
Mm.
and so it really helps people understand, who maybe have not had this experience, that like you need people, you need words, you need all of these things to really become who you are. And yet by the time we meet Max as a full grown adult in 2019, he's actually struggling a little bit with the mobilization of like queer and trans culture via the internet in his teaching gigs. So can you talk a little bit about, I felt like probably you had a really good time writing that part. Like
Mhm.
you were probably, indulging some much needed exorcism of some culture war issues. Talk a
Sure.
little bit about that part, and also maybe what it means to be writing sort of leftist culture war critiques to a
Mhm.
more general audience.
Yeah, it's tough, right? It has to be done really carefully, so it doesn't tip into too far to that side that we don't want to tip into. Um, but basically what happens is Max is a high school teacher at a very sort of upscale private prep school, and he uses the word tranny in class to refer to himself, and he's joking, and he knows he's joking, but some of the kids in the classroom don't like the joke or don't get the joke, right? And one in particular, who I was very careful to make sure that she was like, I wanted her to be the most cis, straight, femme identified person who you just feel like, and anyway, she takes issue with it. And so then that snowballs. And he is sort of like put on probation from his job and has to see a sensitivity trainer who is also really like, not trans, not queer. And so the irony of all that is absolutely where I had the fun, in it. Um,
Yeah,
yeah.
I mean, and we see these things. I mean, it would be even funnier if it was not also devastatingly true that these things happen all the time, right? That people get
Yeah.
called in by people who do not share their identity to,
Mhm.
to make sure that they're in compliance with certain DEI ideas that are not
Right.
actually in the service of justice, right?
Right.
We
Right.
hear it about white DEI trainers talking to people of color, all kinds of things like
Mhm.
that. That do not make anybody more free, but are mostly about litigation, right? So,
Right.
um, I think that you do a really smart thing in the character of Donna, who is Max's sister,
Mhm.
um, because Donna is more of a traditional like MAGA Republican.
Mhm.
She's somebody who went a different way. She's his older sister, and there are, she's Dakota's grandmother, and
Mhm.
she's had a different life. She's had her own version of a hard life, right? Very different than Max's, and their fights, their sibling fights, as they're trying to clean out their mother's house, were some of my favorite parts of the book,
Mm.
because I felt like they felt very real in a way that I think often people struggle to write. Leftists broadly struggle to write the genuine critiques that people on the right have of sort of liberal overreach around things, and I think
Mm.
her critiques of it, even when they're misplaced, you can feel Max's anxiety building as he tries to be like, no, but not that. Like, I know, like, I didn't like this part and I got fired for this, but not that.
Right. Right.
So I feel like anybody who's ever had to go home to a more conservative family at a holiday can relate to the like, here's this, no, this part, yeah, but this, the anxiety of that. So can you talk a little bit about writing Donna and how you crafted her character more generally, and then
Mhm.
particularly like using those conversations as a way to talk to the reader?
Sure. Yeah. Donna, so I come from a MAGA family. So these are people that I know and love. Um, so had some real experiences to pull from. And wanted to approach her with compassion, right? And just paint her as a real person, not as some kind of monstrosity. Um, and she, she's a little hard to deal with, but there are those moments where I mean, those are uncomfortable moments, right? Where you're agreeing with somebody who's on the quote unquote other side, or that sort of Venn diagram where there's some piece of overlap, right? And you're coming, or you tell yourself you're coming at it from one angle that is the right angle, and they're coming at it from the wrong angle. Um, I don't know how much that is actually true, but it becomes impossible to talk about, right? I mean, because then what happens is you sort of, the threat is that you're going to get pulled over. I mean, this is the splitting that we're doing in our culture right now. I think this is a very sort of like, we're in a borderline personality collective moment, right? And I say that in terms of like the primary defense is like this splitting into all good or all bad, and there's no way there can be any overlap. So those moments of overlap, I think, particularly in this moment in history, can feel so frightening and threatening. Of we might actually have similar feelings on this. So yeah, that comes up what around like Max is sort of complaining about about different sort of gender identities or something like that, and Donna sort of thinks, oh, we're on the same page, and she chimes in with, now they've got 15 genders, and if the kindergarten teachers have to teach 15 genders, and if they don't do it, they're going to be put in jail, sort of insanity. Yeah. Is that what you're referring
Yeah,
to?
yeah.
Yeah.
He's like, no, 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 that's not true.
Right. Yeah, it very quickly tips into the crazy.
Yeah,
Right. Yeah.
and I think that that tension that probably many viewers have experienced of also, particularly if you're trans, like having people in your life who she also is like honors him as a man completely, he's Uncle Max, but also is always like, oh, remember you used to have such beautiful hair as a girl, like all of
Mhm.
that, which your mileage may vary as a trans person about how much you care about stuff like that. Like some trans people are like, yep, like that's I did have beautiful hair as a girl, it's gone now. Like like some people are really fine with that, and then some
Yeah.
people are really struggle with that constant sort of almost verbal tick that some says people have about needing to remind you that they remember what you used to look like.
Right.
But I felt like that was done really well, because it is almost a kind of like, on my bad days I can feel like really frustrated by it, but on my good days I'm like, you're claiming a kind of ownership and kinship with me. This is about
Hmm.
saying, I know you, I still know you, like
Yeah.
I've known you since you were a little kid, and you're part of me, and so
Right.
I think there's a way in which Donna as a character reminded me of a lot of conservative people that I know who are like, we're still kin, like you might be a queer, but you're my queer. And I think there's
Right.
a larger
Right.
kind of ethos of that in this town too.
Hmm.
At least within certain limits, it's like, yeah, you're our, and I think this happens more in more like rural and ex-urban places. Although I don't, it happens in pockets of urban places too. But it's like, no, you're our person. You might be a
Right.
total freak, and we're gonna make fun of you. But if an outsider tries to hurt you or take you away, we will fight them, right? And
Right.
so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about sort of that culture, and then the moments when it tips, without, I don't want spoilers, but like
Yeah.
how those sort of like in group out group things work when someone is a gender outlaw.
Sure. Sure. Yeah, that in-group stuff is really interesting amongst conservatives, right? That like how we often hear this, that conservative folks are more likely to embrace something unfamiliar once it becomes familiar, once it's somebody that they know,
Yeah.
right? And that may or may not translate to, well, now I'm going to vote differently. I mean, often I think it doesn't translate to that, unfortunately. Um, but it is like that sense of like your family, and if your family, we're going to protect you, until the person does something. And I don't know how to talk about this without giving spoilers. Till the person does something that feels totally outside, it becomes this offense, and then the person who's inside becomes an outsider. Like I use it takes place in Massachusetts, so I use the witch trials a little bit as a metaphor for people who were part of a community and then behaved in a way that made them a threat, and then they had to become other, right? They became witches. They became these sort of demonic people who were no longer part of the group anymore. um, and that's always the risk when you're a queer, right? Because things can turn on a dime, and they are turning right now. So we had this moment of like the trans tipping point, and trans, it felt like, oh, trans is now part of the American family, right? And now it's changing again, it's shifting again. um, and it can shift very, very quickly.
Yeah, and the mobilization, particularly around taboo uh, crimes, like you know, most notably like the idea of grooming, of child sexual abuse, the idea that um, trans people are abusers, sexual abusers, and pedophiles and things like that. Which that is a accusation that was mobilized against gay and lesbian people, decades before, and then that sort of more or less resolved as gay and lesbian people were more broadly absorbed into mainstream culture, and then now this is, there's been a resurgence of this language towards trans people. This idea that we're trying to, um, that there's some sexual thrill in making kids trans. Like it's the logic is even stranger than I can really understand. But or even the mutilation, the body mutilation, which has this like satanic
Mhm.
vibe to it. And so I think it's smart of you to refer to the witch trials, because I do feel like um, there's only like a handful of things that really get someone excommunicated, especially given the amount of violence that exists in this community, right? Like you
Mhm.
can do a lot of violent shit,
Mhm.
um, but there are these handful of taboo things, right?
Right.
And I think a lot of people intuitively know what those are, and queer
Mhm.
and trans people certainly intuitively know what those are, and do a lot. I think a lot of queer and trans people do a lot of self protection around that. Like don't necessarily have relationships, like platonic friendships and relationships with younger people, or do
Mhm.
not want that, even the appearance of impropriety, because that there's the fear around that. And so the relationship between Sylvia and Mel, um, always has to kind of take place. Sylvia intuits from the very beginning that it's probably not a great idea to be seen with Mel in
Yep.
public, because she knows like this is not smart. You
Mhm.
know, nobody really wants you know to be seen um, potentially influencing a younger kid, right?
Mhm. Right.
So and unfortunately, yeah, it's very timely. Can you talk a little bit about the shaping of the book? So, how did you? What was the first seed of the book? Where did you begin, and then how did you shape the two timelines?
Sure. Sure. The seed of the book was so the scene in the book where Mel sees Sylvia for the second time when she's outside the post office, right? And the mother of the friend points out the car window and says, "There's the tranny." That was an experience I had. So in my small town, there was a trans woman who was there very briefly. I don't know why she was there, if she lived there briefly or had family there, whatever it was. And I would hear about this person using that word tranny. And I was maybe like 12 or 13 years old and remembered feeling very fascinated and excited and not knowing why. At that time, I would feel that way. And catching this glimpse of her outside the post office mailing letters. And then she, just like Sylvia in the book, walked behind the post office, which meant that she lived in that part of the neighborhood back there. So I would get on my bike and look for her, not knowing why I was looking for her, not knowing what I was looking for. And I never found her. I probably went maybe 2, 3 times and rode around searching and never found her. And that was the end of my story. So this was very much like a what if? What if I'd found her? What if? So imagining myself through this kid and what would have happened if um, I had an encounter with this person who represented the outside world. In my imagination, she's very much part of New York, about another place on the planet, another way of living, um, and very cool and queer and rock and roll, and doesn't give a shit about what anybody thinks of her.
I love that.
Yeah.
So you began there, and then how did you realize that you needed a 2019 Max?
It's a good question. I wrote all of 1984 first, and then I wrote 2019 and kind of wove it through. 2019 is the chapters are pretty much are all shorter than the 1984 stuff, so they were like really little interstices. Um, why did I do 20? I don't know how I figured out that I needed 2019. I think there was just more that I wanted to express, more framing that I wanted to have in there that would have the awareness and the intelligence of someone looking back at that time and putting it into the perspective that Max is able to put it into. Just made sense.
Yeah. So you're known as a journalist and a nonfiction writer, and in how how did you was this just a story? I mean, obviously it's a story that's been inside you a long time. How are you? How did you know like now's the time? I'm writing this novel.
I mean, just like the long story of my writing life, right? So I'm 52 and I've been writing for a long time. And I started off as a poet and, didn't have a lot of success as a poet, as few poets do, I think. Um, Tried writing some screenplays, novels. I've written maybe close to 10 novels. They've, lots and lots of rejection, uh, rejection from agents, rejection from editors. It just sort of goes on and on. Um, and I started the blog Vanishing New York in 2007. In some ways, as a place of like, well, nobody's going to publish me, so I'll just have a blog. And that worked. Who knows what's going to work, right? And that became popular in New York. And I started to try to sell the novels again, and with nobody wanted them. And what people wanted was Vanishing New York, the book. So I've told people this. It's like I didn't want to write that book. I wasn't really interested in writing that book, but it's what people wanted. So I wrote Vanishing New York, the book, in the hopes that it would enable me to sell my novels. Um, it didn't. People still didn't want my novels. Um, and so I wrote this book, and my agent sent it out in March of 2020, and needless to
Jeez.
say, didn't really take off. Um, so then I wrote Feral City. I was in the midst of pandemic lockdown in New York, and there was just so much going on. So Feral City came out of that experience, and then the editor who published Feral City bought this novel, and so it's due to those two Jeremiah books that I was able to get this novel out into the world. So it feels like this arrival. I've been like trying all
Yeah.
these different ways to get here, you know.
So you know, we Sarah Schulman famously has talked a lot. So Sarah Schulman's a really, for folks who are watching, really important New York lesbian activist and critic and literary critic, cultural critic, and she's talked for a long time about lesbian erasure um, in fiction, really, but in publishing more generally, how hard it is to be reviewed in the sort of big places. And to a certain extent, there has been transmasculine erasure. And, there are great transmasculine books, but, anecdotally, they're not getting reviewed to the same degree as our trans feminine counterparts.
Mhm.
And it seems a bit like that might be your experience as well. And I'm wondering kind of why you think that is. I have some ideas about why that might be, but and
Yeah.
Sarah Schulman certainly does.
Mhm,
But I
mhm.
wonder, if you could talk about it, because obviously, like
Yeah.
you've fought an even longer road than I knew to get here. This book is wonderful. It's really an important book, I think, and I want more people to read it. So, what do you what's your take on that?
Yeah. Yeah. It's tricky, right? And it's kind of mysterious. Um, so far this book it's not getting reviews. I'm not getting interviews. It's like crickets for this book, and it's been out for a couple weeks, but by now there should be a lot more energy around it, and there's not. And it's fascinating because I had the other two books. They were under a different name, but people know who I am, and I got attention for those, and so it's a market difference. Um, I think I've been thinking a lot about this, and I want to think about it as like turning the lens off of trans and onto the cisgender gaze and what cisgender people, but talk about it as the cisgender gaze wants from trans people, right? And wanting to like, I want to unpack that. I don't have it unpacked. Maybe you've got some ideas to share about that, but um, I think that the cisgender gaze is excited by trans femininity in the broadest sense of trans femininity, from whether that's like gay men who are expressing femininity, drag queens, trans women, And that excitation can go in the direction of violence, right? Murder, as we know. Trans women are hyper visible, um, and often targeted, and we know that a lot of the legislation that's going on is really trans misogyny. It's really directed at trans women. So that excitation can go in the way of violence. It can be uh, erotic fetishization, and it can also go in the direction of celebration. I think that there's a fantasy in the cis gays that the magical trans feminine person is going to come in and liberate gender in some way for cis people. Um, I often think of the movie Tu Wong Fu, Thanks for Everything, Julie Newmar, right? Where these drag queens show up in this dusty town, I think in Texas or something, and sort of liberate everybody from the bonds of patriarchal gender. Um, so all of that and more, I think, gets put on trans women and trans femininity, and ends up in all kinds of representations that are typically problematic in lots of ways, right? And then when it comes to trans masculinity, and I'm using that to go from like butch dyke expression, drag kings, trans men, and all of the spectrum of that expression, there's something else that happens. And there's a lack of excitation in the cisgender gaze. But it's not just an absence. I think there's an actual doing that's happening. But that doing is so covert that you can't really get your fingers on it. You can't take a picture of it. You can't prove that it's happening, but it's happening. And that's what I really am interested in pulling apart. Like, what's going on for people, and what is that about? And we see it for lesbians as well, right?
Yeah. I mean,
What are your yeah
I think that people don't know how. I think on a market level, I mean, some of this is just about capitalism, right?
yeah
It's
yeah
like on a market level, you and I have become like the invisible baseline for the market, right?
right.
So why would that be interesting, right? Like all of us like
Mm-hmm.
becoming, presumably like straight white men is not a thing that anyone cares about, right? But I think
Right.
the lack of interest in like it's very like the again, this is like sort of an in-group and out-group conversation that's hard to have, and that
Yeah.
ways that are sort of mimetic within your novel. But I think there, even within feminism, like but certainly without feminism, and within like sort of pop cultural conversations, it's like it's very like people make a lot of offhand jokes about hating men, like let's just be done with men, but there's
Mm-hmm.
very little engagement around like there is no end to patriarchy without healing with men, right? Like there's
Sure.
no fucking way we tear down the patriarchy unless men are 100% involved, and yet the sort of knee-jerk thing is always fuck men, and for often deeply good reason, right? Like I'm not confused about the reasons for that, but I
Mm-hmm.
think when you become the privileged, or at least visibly privileged patriarchy, it's like the there's no reckoning with the ways in which people like you and me can radically transform someone's gendered life, right? Like I think just as much as those drag queens could fulfill a fantasy about like
Mm-hmm.
radically transforming someone's gendered life, like
Mm-hmm. We're
so could
magical. We're magical too.
we are magical. I do believe that.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
we're also basic and boring and all those things, right? I mean, I think
Mm-hmm.
that's part of the joy of this, middle-aged novel is like, yeah, we're also just like have to
Mm-hmm.
pay our
Mm-hmm.
taxes.
Sure.
But
Sure.
I think the I think part of the reason is that our culture doesn't know how to reckon with any men. So then like it
Mm-hmm.
really doesn't know how to reckon with trans men. Because it's like we're not even treating men as in the same way that our culture doesn't really know how to reckon with whiteness. Like there's just like there's a there's a way in which it's like, well, what do we do with this? Because we still are not even honoring the fact that there's a specificity to masculinity that, as opposed to a default.
Mhm.
Um, and so that's my sense of it. And that sense of erasure can be a kind of safety after, on an individual level. It's a kind of safety, at least for me it has been, after decades of being targeted, for transphobic
Mhm.
and homophobic violence. Like,
Yeah.
just looking like a regular man has been, a psychological gift for
Sure,
me.
sure.
But on a cultural level, in terms of what I think will move the needle for changing patriarchy, like, I think that men need to be made visible in all of our diversity.
Mhm, mhm. Sure, absolutely, yeah. That invisibility for me was also a relief at the beginning of in the early years of my transition, which are now 30 years ago, right? It has chafed um, since then. It's like this sense of like, and Max has this kind of um, complaint, I guess, too, of being lumped in like this Twitter thing of like trans men are men, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which I appreciate, but also leaves out a whole lot of our complexity. And
Yeah.
we're not cisgender men. Um, and I'm okay with, I know a lot of trans guys aren't okay with, I'm okay with that. It's a different experience. And a lot of writing this book was about honoring and explicating that experience for me, that different experience. And that there is well, we were talking earlier about the girlhood question. Like, did I have a girlhood? Did we have girlhoods? Where do you put that in your history as a trans man? How do we reckon with that part? Um, and for me, the answer is, yes and no. Like, I had a trans guy girlhood. I mean, no, we don't have language for this stuff. We don't have language for thinking about our pasts, thinking about all the complicated parts of ourselves. All the language falls on the binary into and it's just it doesn't do it. So the risk of saying I had a girlhood means that some people are going to concretize that for me, and they're going
Yeah.
to make me into I was a girl, right? And I don't want that to happen. But if I say I didn't have a girlhood, that's not true for me, because I had all these girl experiences, um, and that's an important part of my life.
Yeah. I think that collapsing, again, comes out of trans misogyny in a lot of ways. The, like, trans men are men is the corollary
Yeah,
that gets shouted because we have to shout trans women are
right,
women.
right,
And the
right.
reason that we have to shout that is because of trans misogyny and because of all of these hateful
Yes,
bills, and all of this
exactly.
stuff. And I think a lot of trans women that I know are also very willing and would prefer greatly to not even engage in that conversation. But they're
Hmm.
like, I don't
Hmm.
really care. Like, I don't need to argue
Yeah,
this point. I just want to be free of violence and live my fucking life. But because the stakes are so high, we are
right,
having to make these
right,
absolutist arguments that I think most
right.
trans people in real life are, like, not that pressed about.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
it's
So
like,
it's another way that we don't get to like that in real life. Like because of the stakes and because of what's being pressed on trans women and trans men and transness in general, right? We don't get to have public conversations that feel really real because we're always trying to fend off the transphobes, right? I just thinking about the way when I started transition, you had to tell a particular story about your gender, and it had to be really binary, and it had to be really heteronormative, and if it wasn't, you might not get the letters that you needed to get hormones and surgery, right? And so those stories became the stories that we believed about ourselves, and I'm so grateful to newer and younger trans and non-binary people for like, helping to really crack that open. And I think as an older trans person, I've benefited from the way younger and newer people are expanding gender, because it's made thoughts available to me that weren't available in the 1980s and 90s when I was coming out as trans, you know.
Yeah, I think the same is true for me. I mean, I thought it took me a much longer time to understand myself as trans because I thought that I had to move across the country and be completely stealth and never talk to my family again. And I was
Yeah.
like, well,
Yeah.
I don't want to do that, so I must not want it bad enough. Like
Right.
that was what I believed. And so I think it wasn't until watching, yeah, much younger people be like, what are you talking about? Like,
Mhm.
that's not real, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and I think again that the cross generational possibility models that, to go back to your novel, exist in both directions for Max. He has
Mhm.
Sylvia when he's young, and then he has his grand nibbling or niece
Yes. Yes.
when
Yes.
he's older, and it's like that is how we keep each other alive, is being like, oh no, you don't have to keep doing it this way.
Right.
Even if
Right.
you've always done it this way, you can change. You can change in
Mhm.
midlife. You can change when you're 75. You can keep changing. And I think that's the thing that makes trans people so scary to cis people. It's just this idea
Mhm.
of like, none of this has to be fixed. And like, you can change your mind. You can
Right.
stop taking hormones. You can take them again. All this stuff of
Mhm.
like,
Mhm.
what if you make a mistake? And I'm like,
Right.
what if you do? Like, haven't you made some mistakes? Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
like it's a
Oh my
strange.
God. Do you know many people have children and regret it for the rest of it? I mean, you brought a human being into the world.
Yeah,
There's so much
it's
regret around having children,
there's
you
so
know.
much regret around
Marriage,
almost
all the
everything.
yeah, yeah, sure.
Like, to
The
be
thing that
human is
gets
to regret.
upheld is like, right, the thing that one is supposed to do, get married and have children,
Yeah.
as if that isn't gonna be filled with all kinds of mixed feelings and yeah.
So I did want to invite folks, if folks have questions, they can put them in the chat. One of the things that I did want to talk about was geography, because your other books are interested in geography and placemaking,
Mhm.
and I I am somebody who's very interested in placemaking and in geography, and particularly because I grew up. I'm from Atlanta. I've lived here basically my entire life, and I have transitioned visibly publicly in this place, right? And so I think my body feels like, in some ways, very related to this place for me. And so I wonder what, if anything, you think trans people have to say about geography or places that cis people don't. Or Max in this case, because Max has a very different relationship. Max wants to keep the family house, and his sister's like, let's tear it down and sell it to this developer, right? Like, his
Mhm.
sister is not his sister, who arguably is much closer to being from the culture
Mhm.
that this book inhabits, has no nostalgia or sentimentality about keeping their mother's home. But
Sure.
Max, who's gone away and come back, does. So what are you, what, if anything, are you
Yeah.
playing with?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm not sure how to answer the question. Where my thoughts go is to something that I write often about is nostalgia, right? And that the original meaning of nostalgia is homesickness, and that I think for a lot of trans people or in trans experience, there is a sense of never being at home in one's body, and the fantasy of someday I will be at home in this body, which doesn't happen, right? Like um, we can get closer, I think, but like a lot of things that we fantasize about in the future, the fantasy is so much more beautiful and perfect than the reality, right? Which doesn't mean that the reality, it doesn't matter. The reality does matter, and one wants to get there. But um, so that's what I'm thinking about. Like the sort of, for me, New York was always about searching for a place that was going to feel like home, because home never felt like home, you know. And so to me, the urban is the queer space, the trans space, and I know that's very urban centric, and that there are queers in lots of places around the country and the world. Um, but for me, it was always about getting to the city and getting to a place where there could be spontaneity, and you know, in the city, so much clashes together, so much difference clashes together of all kinds, which doesn't really happen in small towns and suburbs. Those are tend to be much more controlled spaces, although cities are becoming more and more controlled, policed. But so that's where that takes me in my mind.
Yeah,
Does
I
that
love
is
that.
that yeah?
Yeah, yeah.
You had some thoughts about that. Did you want to?
Well, I think of it almost like a palimpsest. Like, what are the things? Like, if trans bodies are kind of like this thing that gets reinscribed, right? And we remember who we are and who we've always been on the inside, but to the outside world, you know, if you medically transition, you look really different. And sometimes people, if you stay in the same place, people can either update their vision of you or not, right? But, you know, people see you and see your evolving gender. And it's always interesting to me when people recognize me and when they don't. Like, the
Mm-hmm.
people who have, like, and sometimes it's the people who are the loosest, who have the weakest ties,
Uh-huh.
who see me and are like, oh, hey, like, no problem seeing the second grader that I was, right? Like, my Sunday
Right.
school teacher from the second grade, like, did a quick mental, like, I had not informed her that I was trans, like, but didn't skip a beat, you know, super Catholic, honed
Mm-hmm.
right in, knew who I was, no problem. But then
Mm.
people who are arguably much closer and much more important to me, like, still are reinscribing that feminine self onto me, that, you
Uh-huh.
know, and I, you know, there are lots of ideas about that, but I think about
Sure.
that in terms of cities too, and like my experience of the geography of Atlanta that I can't shake, that is like not real anymore. Like,
Mm-hmm.
Atlanta has moved on. Like, the cities of my childhood, my 20s, my 30s, like, those places are no longer there. Just as New York is, you know, the New York of my 20s that I would visit when I was in college, like, that's not there anymore. No
Yeah.
part of it is there anymore,
Yeah.
really. And so but my internal geography is
Mm-hmm.
so
Mm-hmm.
present and so there, and just all like smashing down on
Yeah.
itself all at once. And it's like, I don't know, for me it's like it's useful to have an external, like, experience of that, to be like, oh,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
here's this deli that used to be this other thing, that used to be this other thing, and I
To be kind
went,
of like the experience of being in a transitioned body in a transitioned place.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. 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 Sure. Sure.
it's
There's that kind of like that haunted quality of, right? That I think of trans people that were always sort of haunted by the past body, gender, whatever you want to call it, right? That's always sort of with us. And how do we negotiate that as we go through life, right? I think that, like you said, like we were told, like you go stealth and you cut off, and you also we're supposed to cut off from your past gendered expression, whatever you want to call that, right? To really sever that. And I don't, as myself and as a psychoanalyst, I don't think that severing anything from ourselves does us any good. In fact, it does a lot of bad for us.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, it's unhealthy. But you know, there are times when strategically, you know, I've had to pretend to be my own wife, you know, like somebody calls and dead
mhm,
names me because I forgot to like
mhm.
change the like
Right, 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 right.
exterminator contract from my old name. And the
Uh-huh,
only way
uh-huh.
I can do it is to be like, oh, I'm so sorry, she's not here right now, let me
Mhm.
handle this, I'm her husband, right? Like, I just,
Right,
you know,
right.
like the weird sort of like doubling that has
Yeah.
to happen sometimes as trans people, where you're like, I'm not gonna fucking explain this to you, buddy. Like, I just need to like make sure that
No.
you come do the like roach spraying, you know,
Right.
like, it's such a weird thing that happens. And like, again, I made a choice to be myself, as much of myself for as much of the time as possible in as many places as possible. And
Mhm.
that was a choice that was both hard and privileged to be able to do that. But I think it's taught me a lot about like what people can see and what
Mhm.
some people can't. You know, like, there are people who are willing to go on that journey with you, and then there are people who get stuck somewhere along the way. And it's not because of
Right.
malice usually. It's because of something in their own psychology most of the time.
Sure, sure.
But I think about it like buildings, like people who
Hmm.
would rather let a building crumble than evolve. You know, there's those
Hmm.
kind of things
Hmm.
too.
Hmm.
Like I get
Yeah.
it. Sometimes I'd rather let a building crumble and evolve for whatever
Hmm.
emotional reason. You know, so
Hmm.
um, I always like to sort of end on, because we're a bookstore, like who are your sort of literary like ancestors,
Mm.
heroes, the people that were sitting on your shoulders while you were writing, the people that you
Hmm.
really would love to like, if you had a magic portal and you could be like, hey, I wrote this for you. Like, are there
Mm.
writers that you had in the room with you mentally while you were writing this book?
It's a good question. I'm not sure if I relate to it that closely, that like speaking to somebody, but certainly, I mean, Carson McCullers comes up a lot. She's mentioned a number of times in the book, and I think of her as you know a very queer writer, um, in terms of not just her own queerness, but also the way she wrote about um, loneliness and freakishness and bodies that are different. Um, so there's that sort of there's something. I've always been attracted to the Southern Gothic, Flannery O'Connor, and I think there's something really trans in that Southern Gothic and something very queer about all of those different kinds of outside bodies. So yeah, I would say Carson McCullers.
Yeah. Uh, well, you should come on down to Georgia for real, and we'll you can go to all their homes. And
Yeah, yeah,
I've always
for
felt
sure.
that they are very queer, and I mean Carson McCullers really was, but Flannery in her own way, I think,
Yeah.
and also being a disabled person and being like having
Hmm.
things inscribed on her that she didn't get to choose. There's a lot of really interesting stuff
Sure.
about her that I think informs a trans experience of moving through the world. So yeah, they're both, I think, amazing role models. And I think we didn't talk quite as much as I had intended to about the humor in this book,
Hmm.
um, but this is a very funny book. I laughed like out loud multiple times, and so maybe like both Carson McCullers and Flannery O'Connor are funny in
Hmm.
their own dark way. So are they your humor role models, or did you how do you think about
Hmm.
humor?
Oh my God, that's a really hard question somehow. I'm glad to hear that it's funny because I
Oh,
think
good.
it's funny, but a lot of people read it and think it's also there's a lot of darkness in it. I get that a lot, that I'm really into queer negativity, um, and uh, you know that doesn't mean humorless.
Yeah.
Um, so I don't know, humor role models. I'm not sure how to answer that. Yeah,
Well, I
yeah,
think I think Flannery O'Connor uh,
yeah.
was
She's in
into the
there.
negative.
Yeah, into the negative for sure, for sure.
I mean, I think the maybe those folks have never been in families like that, where you're just like,
Hmm.
well, like we're just gonna laugh through this because what else are
Yeah,
you gonna do, right?
absolutely.
And I think again the humor works because it's humane, because the things that you're making fun of are human and
Hmm.
relatable, even if politically like some of the folks are not on my side. I
Right.
totally, they are my cousins or my people I grew up around, and I love those people even if I don't agree with where they end up. Like I
Yeah.
care for them and I like their quirks, and I think like the way that they are tough, I admire, even if that's
Mhm.
not the way that I want to be tough, I still
Right.
appreciate it, and I think
Right.
that was the part of Max that I appreciated. It was him kind of trying to be like, what parts of my upbringing do I want to hold on to,
Hmm.
even as I've moved into this very different space.
Yeah.
And like I think that's a universal question. Like that's not a trans question, that's a human question.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. I'm really glad to hear that you like Donna because I think I like her. I mean, and I wanted to write her with all the compassion that I could have because she's also she's also loving in her way, in the way that those cousins, as you say, are also tough and also loving. Um, and I think if you haven't had those people in your life, it's hard to relate to. It's hard to imagine loving those people. Um, you
There is
know.
a hilarious incident with a NutriBullet that made me laugh out loud. That's some real redneck shit, if I do say so myself. So I was like, "Yep, this sounds like it could happen
Uh-huh.
to people I know."
Sure, sure. Absolutely.
So for folks who have not read the book, you have many incidents of humor and also real pathos and heart in here too to look forward to. So I want to encourage folks to click the teal button at the bottom center of the screen to buy Some Strange Music Draws Me In, a novel by Griffin Hansbury. We would love for you to do that right now. This is my insulin pump making crazy noises. So one moment, sorry, it's not supposed to do this, but it's gonna do it right now while we're on camera.
The
Uh,
human.
yeah,
There's the human
I'm
right there.
human,
Yeah,
just making weird noises.
yeah.
Um, Thanks everybody for watching, but especially thank you, Griffin. I mean, again, we're gonna spread the good word on this novel. Everybody who's watching, tell someone. We would love for you to get this book into more hands. Request it from the public library. That's another really great way to spread the word. And if you are affiliated with some publications, request that it get reviewed or maybe write a review. We would love that.
Sure.
Oh, good, Oliver. I'm so glad that you are reading it now. Oliver says, I'm only about a quarter of the way through the audiobook version, and it has kept me laughing and crying. It's such a beautifully written book. Thank y'all for doing this.
Thank
So,
you.
thank you
I,
for being here.
I love
Uh,
to hear that. Laughing and crying is what I love to hear best. Thank you.
yeah. So, thank y'all for spending time with us during Trans Week of Visibility. I think all most trans people have some ambivalence around that this week in this concept. But I feel most excited to be visible when I'm talking about art and talking about like what it means to be struggling with all of these things and all these concepts. So I really appreciate your time with me tonight, Griffin. This has been lovely.
Absolutely. This is a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much. We could keep talking forever, I feel, but have a wonderful night and thanks everybody for coming.
Yeah, you too. Take care.
Okay.
Bye,
Take
y'all.
care. Bye bye.